Thank you, Simon. And again, I want to say thank you to the Cathedral and the Dean for the opportunity to explore these questions with you. As I said last week, it's not like in 3 lectures one can kind of deal with the complexity of the topic of the Bible and violence, but I really appreciated the questions at the end last time because it's given me a variety of things to think about over the past week. So perhaps this evening at the end there'll be some time for questions. This one may be a little longer than last week, and it may be a little more boring because we're going to have to get historical. So in the first of these 3 lectures, I looked at 2 texts from Genesis. We looked at the foundational narrative of Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, and the episode of the slaughter of the Shechemites by Simeon and Levi in chapter 34. Now, one of those texts, Genesis 4, is clearly, I'll say, quasi-mythical in form. And the status of the second narrative, as with all the kind of narratives, historical narratives in Genesis, it's very unclear, since scholars would be pressed to agree to what extent any of the patriarchal narratives in Genesis reflect actual historical events. So they reflect traditions that were being passed around, but how that relates to historical events almost 1,500 years before these texts were being written down, that's a much bigger question. This evening I want to look at 2 other texts of violence, both much more clearly historical in nature. The first of these that we'll look at, I increasingly see as the most significant single text in the Hebrew Bible. It is a poem about a small local revolution, a victory song. It is a long poem by biblical standards, some 31 verses. You have it on the handout. It's, other than perhaps the opening torso of Miriam's song at the sea in Exodus 15, this song is the oldest single extended piece of material we have in the entire Bible. There would be considerable scholarly consensus based on the style of poetry that it dates to somewhere in the period 1250 to 1200 BCE. That's a long time ago. That's, what was that? That's 3,200 years ago. And that is a victory song. It was created very close to the events it describes. It appears in Judges 5, and the song itself is some 5 to 7 centuries older than the prose epic account of the events that we find in Judges 4. In other words, we could say the song is like today's blog, and the prose epic account is someone's novel elaborated from the blog in the year 2614. I want to focus our attention on the poem known as the Song of Deborah because it can open up to us much that is interesting about the earliest confederation of Israelite communities living in the northern hill country. And I want us to begin by reading this poem aloud together. So the copy you have, you'll see it's divided for reading aloud. And where it says all, I'll invite everyone to read with some gusto and enthusiasm. And where it says women, I'll invite the women to read, remembering that in ancient Israel, women were the major singers of public poetry. And there is someone who's going to be the female reader 1. And when you get to the first reading, just read the piece on the left. And then there's a female reader 2, and then we're back to all, and we'll go through the first 3 pages in that way, and we'll read this very ancient song together. So, here we go. When locks are long in Israel, when the people offer themselves willingly, bless the Lord.
Hear, O kings, give ear, O princes. To the Lord I will sing. I will make melody to the Lord, the God of Israel.
Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens poured. The clouds indeed poured water. The mountains quaked before the Lord, the one of Sinai, before the Lord, the God of Israel.
In the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, caravans ceased and travelers kept to the byways. The peasantry disappeared in Israel. They weakened from plunder, until I arose. I, Deborah, I arose, a mother in Israel.
When new gods were chosen, then war was in the gates. Was shield or spear to be seen among 40,000 in Israel?
My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel, who offered themselves willingly among the people. Bless the Lord.
Tell of it, you who ride on white donkeys, you who sit on rich carpets, and you who walk by the way. To the sound of musicians at watering places, there they repeat the triumphs of the Lord, the triumphs of his peasantry in Israel.
Then down to the gates marched the people of the Lord.
Awake, awake, Deborah. Awake, awake, utter a song. Arise, Barak. Lead away your captives, O son of Abinadab.
Then down marched the remnant of the noble. The people of the Lord marched down for him against the mighty. From Ephraim they set out into the valley, following you, Benjamin, with your kin. From Machir marched down the commanders, and from Zebulun those who bear the marshal's staff. The chiefs of Issachar came with Deborah, and Issachar faithful to Barak. Into the valley they rushed out at his heels.
Among the clans of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart. Why did you tarry among the sheepfolds to hear the piping of the flocks? Among the clans of Reuben, there were great searchings of heart. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan, and Dan, why did he abide with the ships? Asher sat still at the coast of the sea, settling down by his landings. Zebulun is a people that soar to death. Naphtali too, on the heights of the field.
The kings came, they fought. Then fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo. They got no spoils of silver. The stars fought from heaven. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The torrent Kishon swept them away. The onrushing torrent, the torrent Kishon. March on, my soul, with might. Then loud beat the horses' hooves with the galloping of his steeds. Curse Meroz, says the angel of the Lord, curse bitterly its inhabitants, because they did not come to the help of the Lord against the mighty.
He asked water, and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a lordly bowl. She put her hand to the tent peg, and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera a blow. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. He sank. He fell. He lay still at her feet. At her feet he sank. He fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead.
Out of the window she peered, and the mother of Sisera.
Chariot so long in coming? Why tarry the hoofbeats of his chariots?
Her wisest ladies make answer. Indeed, she answers the question herself.
Are they not finding in thy spoil a girdle to for every man, spoil of thy stuffs for Sisera, spoil of thy stuffs embroidered, 2 pieces of dyed work embroidered for my neck a spoil.
So perish all your enemies, O Lord, but may your friends be like the sun as it rises in its might. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have encountered that poem before? no shame in not having encountered it. Many people have it. So very few. Many contemporary Christians experience, I think, a certain mystification or even discomfort when they read the Song of Deborah. You may have experienced a bit of that yourself just now. For some, it is just another of those violent poems that reflect an outdated religious past of a xenophobic Semitic nation who worshipped a raging local and tribal male storm god. A measure of this discomfort can be deduced from the Revised Common Lectionary, which in the entire 3-year cycle uses only a single passage from the book of Judges. That passage is about Deborah, but it is not her song. Rather, what we get to read, and some people may have actually heard last Sunday in church, is a later historian's reconstructed version of the beginning of the story from Judges 4. Yet the original song is a rich and layered text, and it is one of the 2 or 3 most radical texts in the entire scriptural tradition. In fact, in Renaissance and Reformation England, unlike our own period, after Esther, Deborah and Jael were the most frequently represented of all biblical characters in women's art and needlework. Both tone and contents identify it as a victory song with liturgical and polyvocal elements, that's many voices, some of which the version divided for reading that I provided for you and that we just used may have surfaced. Whether it's by Deborah is arguable, but it is almost certainly a woman's song since the primary communal singers in ancient Israel, as I said, were women. It comes from the northern hill country region of Israel. So this is the area basically north of here, which is the bulk of Israel. Judah is the lower part in later Israel, this upper part. So if we think about other biblical characters, Hannah and Samuel's mother and her family come from this area of Ephraim. Deborah is up in that area. And Jesus operates up around the Sea of Galilee, and his family and his mother, Mary, come from up there, way up the north end. So, and I'll talk a bit more about that kind of northern aspect of this. So it comes from that northern hill country, and it describes the events surrounding a major communal crisis. In the days of Shamgar, son of Anat, in the days of Jael, caravans ceased and travelers kept to the byways. What is also clear in the poem is that a woman named Deborah rose up and took action. The Hebrew text has her give testimony about her own choices and actions. She saw the people of the land ceasing and weakening from plunder, and so she says, I stood up. Centuries later, the Greek translators, perhaps with a variant of this ancient poem in front of them, rendered this as a statement by the singers about Deborah. They say, you stood up. A shift from testimony of personal experience to acclamation as heroine and leader. But the crisis is socioeconomic. The poem uses a specific technical term for the local people, the peasantry. And this term signifies very specifically people who dwell in open country. These are hill country agricultural folk who live a subsistence life. They're not nomadic, but they're also not city dwellers like the Canaanites. The socioeconomic oppression is coming from the more southerly Canaanite kings. So there are some cities down in this area and on the coast. So the socioeconomic oppression is coming from those kings who not only have the security of walled cities, but have the advantage of advanced technology. This is the beginning of the Iron Age, and they have iron weapons and chariots, enabling them to impose their demands on the populace as they will. The poem tells us the kings have taken control of the major trade routes. Now, for the subsistence open country folk of the northern hills, this means that they have no access to passing caravans for trading their surplus grain and wine, valuable commodities in this sort of economy. They are thus starving, and their children are dying. The poem is very specific. Deborah rises up because of the economic oppression of her community and region, but also because she is a mother in Israel. The narrative of the song in brief. So this is what we just read, and I'll kind of piece together some of the narrative. Deborah draws people together and foments a social revolution. There is division and disagreement in the wider regional community of northern Israel about whether or not to support and participate in the uprising. The Canaanite kings come with their top general Sisera and their iron chariots. The Israelites lead them into the Wadi Kishon, where as a result of a thunderstorm upstream, the Canaanites with their heavy armaments are trapped and drowned. Sisera, the general, escapes and flees, and comes to the tent of a nomadic herder named Heber. The ironic Hebrew text allows this man Sisera, who has just escaped a torrential flash flood in a rocky wadi, to utter one word, Mayim, water, he begs. Heber's wife, Jael, responds to his request for hospitality and water with yogurt in a bowl befitting Sisera's power and rank. Most interpreters infer that he fell asleep, though the poem is not clear. He is certainly exhausted. Jael then takes a tent peg and a mallet and drives it through his temple. In the Hebrew consonants, we hear the blows. Makaka rosho, umakatsa v'chalfa rakato. He dies between her legs. He sank, he fell, he lay still at her feet. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. I think the scholar Mika Ball is correct in her claim that the repeated focalization on him falling between her legs is intended to evoke the images of birth or stillbirth, or perhaps to press the image to its outer limits, the intentional abortion of oppression. This is the narrative in summary. But as you see and experienced, the poem is much more complex than the narrative because the poem structures itself around several juxtapositions and ironic contrasts that embody social analyses and critiques. I will comment on a few of these aspects. So first, this ancient poem, the oldest poem we have in the Bible practically, gives central place to the role of women as spiritual leaders and as key community actors. The name Deborah, which most lexicons say means the bee, sounds like a much more significant biblical word, dabar, which means to speak or to actualize. I think we are to understand through this double meaning that her name is likely to be taken as something akin to the Word made actual. Deborah is a community organizer who works primarily through speaking, singing, urging, exhorting, praising, celebrating, and mocking. All of those things are in the poem. She invites others into a community of solidarity and resistance. She sings it into being. She honors those who participate willingly in the community of resistance, and she holds up to public critique those who are afraid or co-opted by the gods of anxiety and acquiescence to the forces of power and oppression. The other central actor in this poem is Jael, who for her choices and actions is praised twice as most blessed among women. To my knowledge, only one other woman in the entire Hebrew and Greek biblical tradition is spoken of in these terms. And that's when the angel comes to greet Our Lady. Second thing about this poem, unlike other contemporaneous North Semitic poetry that we know from Ugarit, which is just a little north of Israel, which deals mostly with religious myths and symbols, this poem is deeply rooted in human experience and actions in the real world. The experience of oppression, of starvation, of being subject to the forces of violence, of making choices about life and death. It is a monotheistic poem, praising the one who has a name, Yahweh, known as the Lord God of Israel. That one God is engaged on behalf of those who suffer oppression and violence, and of those who choose to stand in resistance, in solidarity and community. Hear, O kings, begins the poem. Give ear, O princes. To the Lord I will sing. I will make melody to the Lord, the God of Israel. This God acts through inspiriting leaders such as Deborah, and also through moving creation in support of justice and inviting people to cooperate in that movement of creation. Even as the poem begins, God has already created the storm that causes the flash flood. Yahweh can be heard thundering in the far southeast near Edom. The storm moves up, and the rain falls somewhere over here, and it's in the Wadi Kishon up here that the events take place. So thirdly, the poem betrays deep ambiguities about violence. It is not ambiguous about social resistance to oppression. But if we look carefully, there is no divine command to go to war. And the question about arms posed early in the poem is ambiguous. Does it refer to the hesitations of non-participants? Remember, it asks, was there sword or spear to be seen among all the people in Israel? So does it refer to the hesitations of those who wouldn't participate? Or does it mean that the people simply had no equipment for fighting? They were farmers. The poem nowhere says that the people of Israel fought with the kings. They led the Canaanite kings and their general Sisera down into the Wadi Kishon. It tells us that. But the poem only tells us that the kings fought. It is in the nature of kings to fight and to be submerged in their assumptions about power and military technology. It is in the nature of the peasants who live in the hills to cultivate ingenuity and attention to the patterns of the natural world. The poem is, in fact, quite insistent that it was the stars that fought against Sisera and his forces. Because in the ancient Israelite universe, it was the movement of the stars away from their locations in the firmament. So remember, they imagined the world as this great thin, hammered out thing. The earth is here, the firmament is above. Underneath, there's water. Above the firmament, there's water. Why do we know that? Because when we look up at the sky, what color is it? Blue. And they knew that the stars moved. And so they thought, the way they imagined the universe was, there's all this water up there, and when the stars move, it creates little holes in the firmament. And what comes through, naturally, if there's holes? Water. Now, we can kind of laugh at that, They weren't naive sometimes as we think scientifically. But that's what this text is alluding to. The stars fought against Sisera because of the rain. And it was that movement of the stars away from their locations in the firmament that opened the holes to let the rain from the waters above fall through. We want to read our preoccupation with Israelite and biblical violence into this counter, but there is no clear evidence of that. So there is ambiguity about the value of communal violence. The only violence in this poem is individual violence, that of Jael, who makes her own personal moral choice to murder Sisera. But Jael's choice is also layered. Her social group, the poem tells us, were Kenites. They were a group that lived on the margins. Whereas archaeology tells us that during this 2-century period, hundreds of small subsistence agriculture communities suddenly appeared, dotted all over this hilly northern region. The Kenites, who were not Israelites, though allied with them, cultivated a different lifestyle. Jael's husband's clan's survival on the margins was dependent on not becoming involved in the tensions between the settled land people and the Canaanite city dwellers and their kings. In the patriarchal nomadic world of the Kenites, Sisera, arriving at the tent, can expect safety and hospitality in Heber's tent. And Jael makes the deliberate choice to break with all these social constraints and conventions to stand from the margins in solidarity with those who are being oppressed. She moves from detachment and safety to risk and commitment. Interestingly, the text is anything but xenophobic. It is the marginal non-Israelite outsider Jael who is the most celebrated and praised of all the figures in the text. Fourthly, the poem clearly delineates, as you've probably already seen, 3 different socioeconomic systems. The Canaanite city-state, fed by an accumulative economy of depredation and plunder. The hill country's subsistence peasantry, who practice a distributive economy. And the marginal nomadic herders. The song also offers an image of a sort of flat, non-hierarchical, egalitarian society in which people come together in forms of mutual support in the face of crisis and in resistance to forms of hegemony. In this, the oldest extended text we have from the ancient Israel, the image is of a very radical set of notions about the nature and structure of community and power. But this ancient song is not some historical blip. The traces of this radical social vision and the tension with what the rest of the world considers normal and desirable are visible through the entire Hebrew Bible. Fifth and finally, in its final 2 sections, the poem explicitly sets up a contrast that pries open issues of the role and expectations of women living in forms of patriarchal social structure. On the one hand, there is Jael, who is praised for her choices to break with the assumptions of the patriarchal system in which she lives. On the other hand is the vivid closing description of Sisera's mother and her handmaids. The song portrays her looking out through latticed windows. It's windows with cross hatching. The security of her Canaanite worldview is also like a prison. Her entire life is focused on and absorbed with her successful and violent son. Twice she asks where his chariots are. But when her wisest ladies and she herself speak, they are completely caught up in a patriarchal vision of this world. The men must be delayed, they say, because they are dividing the spoil and taking captive women for their sexual use and extending their progeny. The Hebrew text does not say a girl or two for every man, as the NRSV that we have in front of us tonight says so politely. The Hebrew text is blunt. A womb or two for every man. In the Canaanite world, women are not humans, are not agents of transformation in community, such as Deborah, or agents of moral choice, such as Jael. For Sisera's mother and her maidens, caught in the assumptions of Canaanite patriarchy, women are simply wombs for men to use. All the women can think about is how the men are bringing fine cloth for them to make luxurious new clothes. Yet tomorrow, as is always the case in societies oriented to violence, these women will be mourning their slain children. The level of irony in this closing section of the poem is phenomenal, even in relation to the consistent use of irony throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible. In setting this contrast up, the poem is the starting point of a much more complex and extended critique of patriarchy throughout the biblical traditions. And I alluded to some of that last week. In the social and spiritual values of Deborah and those who sang with her, their images of community, solidarity, and inclusivity, their ideological critiques, and the trajectories embedded within this 3,200-year-old poem, we might find echoes of some things we care about. Some of them became core elements in the later biblical meta-narrative. Others got suppressed and can only be rediscovered through these localized narratives and moments within the larger text that is our biblical canon. Deborah and Miriam are part of a hidden trajectory that includes Hannah's song and ultimately Mary's song that we say or sing every day at evening prayer. I want to shift our gaze now to the other end of the trajectory of Israelite history. So we've been way back here with Deborah at 1250, the very beginnings of Israel, as in any historical sense. And now I want to shift us down to this period right in here. So we're going to look at the period in the century before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 587 BCE. Let's set this into a broader historical framework. The biblical version of this history tells us a story of a people who worshipped one God, Yahweh the Lord, and who fell away into the worship of other gods. That's a one-sentence description of the whole kind of biblical narrative from Judges, well, in fact, even earlier than Judges, but certainly Judges through the end of 2 Kings. Archaeologists and other historians suggest that the reality was more complex. Back to the map. It's likely that in the southern region, known as Judah, down here, there was very little population earlier than the late 8th century BCE, and that in that region, normative religious practice was much more diverse than the biblical accounts allow. In fact, in a series of provocative studies since the 1990s, the English biblical scholar Margaret Barker has argued that the distinctive polytheistic worship and theology of the first Jerusalem temple, and she argues that's what it was like, was destroyed by the Deuteronomists completely in the period after 722, or 622. Margaret Barker argues that this temple theology lingered on, though, in priestly circles, communicated in what we now know as the genre of apocalyptic, and that it is central to understanding the emergence of Christianity and its liturgy in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, especially in the importance attributed to Mary as Mother of God. You can, if you're interested, if you look up World Wide Web margaretbarker.com, you can find a kind of selection of her shorter pieces. She's a very interesting thinker. For some people, she's seen as rather a maverick. Rowan Williams thought she was good enough to give her a Lambeth D.D. for her contributions to temple theology and biblical scholarship. And I think, in fact, there are some very valuable things to think about in what she has to offer. So that's in the south, where there's very little population. In the north, there was much more population, but there also, as even the Song of Deborah shows, there's a much stronger monotheistic strain in the northern mountainous region of Israel, which was associated with those egalitarian motifs and the traditional resistance there to the great and oppressive patriarchal and hierarchical religion Baalism, which taught that men by nature had the right to dominate and use women, children, and weaker men both economically and relationally in the family and in society. 2 Kings makes clear that northern Israelite local resistance to kingship and the socioeconomic manifestations of the Baalite Omride dynasty took the form of repeated and increasingly violent military coups. Now, all of this ended for the northern kingdom in 722, when this preposterous kingdom of Israel was overrun by the Assyrians, and the people were deported all over the Near East. In 1716 in the south, Judah's king Hezekiah became ruler in the Davidic line in Jerusalem. During his reign, the Assyrians, and they're coming in from way up in the northeast here, down through Syria, but the Assyrians, the first of the great empires of this 1,000-year period, attacked and besieged Jerusalem. And despite a mysterious withdrawal and deliverance, Jerusalem effectively became a vassal state, paying tribute and taxes. During the following century, the population of the southern kingdom grew to its greatest number, perhaps doubling or tripling. Judah experienced growth and economic prosperity, but also extreme taxation to pay tribute that burdened the poor most of all. And it also experienced high political insecurity and anxiety. It entered into political alliances wherever it could. And the two kings who followed Hezekiah, Manasseh and Amon, encouraged whatever forms of religion they encountered that seemed to promise security and social stability. Between the Assyrians threatening from the north and the stressed local economic situation, Judah seems to have been in crisis. The single largest block of material we have in our Bible, the book of Deuteronomy, and the long history associated with it, running from Joshua through Judges, Samuel, and Kings, had its origins in one response to that moment of crisis. In general, scholars have associated the book of Deuteronomy in one of its early forms with the reign of the young King Josiah around 622. So that's the piece I've circled in. I think that's supposed to be blue. During a period of repairs to the temple, and you have this narrative on the last 2 pages, during a period of repairs to the temple, the high priest Hilkiah discovers a scroll of the covenant and sends it to the king. On hearing it read, Josiah is convinced disaster is looming. The message of the scroll is authenticated by the prophetess Huldah, who one ancient tradition says was Jeremiah's aunt. The biblical text itself states that a priest named Hilkiah was Jeremiah's father. Probably not the same man, though. King Josiah sets about a major religious reform, centralizing all worship in Jerusalem, destroying the religious artifacts of the diverse religions operating in Judah and Jerusalem, purifying the priesthood of unacceptable practices, having the law read in public, holding a Passover celebration. This account in 2 Kings 22 to 23 comes to us from inside the Deuteronomic tradition. And so for them, Josiah, the purifier and reformer, is its great hero. The scroll discovered in the temple was likely the high priest Hilkiah's own strategy for a major political and religious intervention. The traditional association between the prophet Jeremiah and Hilkiah's family points us to the influence of key prophetic traditions on Hilkiah's own thinking about what was necessary for social and political stability, as well as for his own greater control of Judah's religious life. He waits almost 2 decades until he has the trust of the young king. He creates a document which draws together the best of the ancient traditions of justice and egalitarian order, likely brought south over the previous century as northerners fled Assyrian encroachment and violence. He frames it in a contemporary form like a political treaty or contract, the exact sort of thing the Assyrians forced on all their subjugated vassals, known as a covenant. And he turns the Assyrians' covenant structure of promises and threats into a theological message of conditional reward and punishment by God. Based both on the historical fate of Israel to the north and Samaria a century before, and his sense of the most likely prognostications if the current international political directions continue. So in this conditional reward and punishment, obedience to the one Lord leads to prosperity and security. Disobedience and injustice leads to divine anger and political subjugation and deportation. He solidifies his own power and influence by introducing the notion that there is to be only one central place of worship and sacrifice in all Israel and Judah, and that one place is to be Jerusalem, not the hundreds of local sanctuaries that had been around for centuries. And he addresses the political anxiety and social fragmentation. Remember, you've got all these people who moved into the region over the past century. So he addresses that social fragmentation by creating what I'll call a manageable social project. Idol smashing, altar burning, and singling out and murdering wicked or false priests and leaders. Finally, to create a cohesive political unit from the disparate groups that have migrated into the region of Judah, he creates a culture of xenophobia and hatred of foreigners and their cultural and religious practices. Hilkiah presents this model covenant to the idealistic young king in his mid-20s, who is looking for some way to break free of the past and set his mark on the kingdom he rules. The document is prophetically authenticated by a wise, elderly matriarch who also promises Josiah that he will not suffer the worst fate promised in the book. Next thing, the Deuteronomistic movement is royal policy, and gangs are out smashing altars and killing priests and grinding idols and pillars to dust. Sorry. It really wants to dance tonight. It's a woodcut from a 7th. Now, what I've just given you is a rather cynical, but not implausible way to present what is happening. I think it's equally important for us to recognize that while complex and not always nice human motivations go into this great moment of religious reform, it is also a moment of genuine and faithful response by the high priest to a moment of national crisis and collapse. It worked in the short term, but we know from the biblical witness that the strategy did not succeed in the medium term. After Josiah, his descendants went back to their international political maneuvering with all its religious accompaniments. And in 587, so we're only talking 35 years later, Jerusalem was besieged and destroyed, and the priestly and royal leadership deported to Babylon. That's in the medium term, but we know something else. In the long term, this movement caught on with the poor and underprivileged, the Am Haaretz, who were left behind because they were too insignificant to deport, the ordinary people of the land. It also continued in priestly and prophetic circles and became the framework for a new way of drawing together, reimagining, and retelling a history of the Israelite people and their relationship with their unique God of justice and mercy. In that retelling, central elements of the Deuteronomistic meta-narrative are the conditional theology, the framework of reward and punishment, and a reiterated narrative element that sees people as constantly falling into sin and being rescued, then falling into sin again. So powerful is this meta-narrative that many people see it as the normative form of the narrative of divine human relationships. It is the meta-narrative around which the later redactors in the Persian period come to frame much of the Torah, as well as the Deuteronomistic history. But I want to talk now a bit, so this is an incredibly important moment. And now in the last bit of the lecture, I want to talk about the kind of longer-term impact of this Deuteronomistic ideology and theology. This meta-narrative has had at least two major impacts on the Christian tradition. One is that traced by the contemporary German theologian Michael Welker in his God the Spirit, identifying the narrative traditions of judges that have been incorporated into the Deuteronomistic history as traditions that represented some of the oldest biblical accounts of how the Holy Spirit acts. Welker observes that the ancient pattern of this meta-narrative is the same pattern as that found in the final section of the Creed. The community falls into sin, ignorance of God, oppression, and brokenness. That's the first stage in it. The Spirit empowers the gifts of someone. People are drawn together into a community of resistance. People experience repentance and forgiveness and deliverance from forms of oppression. The entire community knows new life. That's the little Deuteronomistic narrative. We find it all through Judges, but it reappears constantly. And Welker says, if we look at the last section of the Creed, I believe in the Holy Spirit. People drawn together into community of resistance, the Holy Catholic Church, the communion of saints. They experience repentance and forgiveness and deliverance from forms of oppression, the forgiveness of sins. The entire community knows new life, the resurrection of the body, and the life everlasting. In other words, the early church didn't just throw together a few brief thoughts about the Holy Spirit on the spur of the moment, but was reflecting long-standing and deeply rooted understandings that the Spirit was not some whooshy, vague impulse of well-being, but acted in concrete, consistently describable ways to deliver and transform human communities and to resist evil, idolatry, oppression, and injustice in the world. So that's one long-term impact. The second long-term impact of this theology is more problematic. The Deuteronomistic theology of conditional reward and punishment makes of God a violent, constantly aggrieved and disciplining father-king figure. And because the meta-narrative is cyclical, it makes humanity a race incapable of escaping the endless cycle of failure. All Deuteronomistic narratives are narratives of failure, decline, and disaster. John Keble in the 19th century, in his Tract 13, traces the way that this meta-narrative figures in the selection of Sunday morning Old Testament readings in the Book of Common Prayer, so that on a yearly basis, people hear and are reminded and shaped by its assumptions. This imaging of God is also central in much contemporary evangelical theology and preaching. And behind that, in the popular and common forms of Anselmian atonement theology. Taking up the Deuteronomistic strain, this version of the atonement argues that because we are so wicked and disobedient and incapable of any right relationship with God, God has to punish us. The punishment has to be so severe that only God's Son, sent in human form, can fulfill that task. and it can only be done by God's Son being killed for us. I mean, that's a short summary of the popular way that you hear Anselm's kind of theory of the atonement projected. So, that's kind of two long-term impacts of the theology. The Deuteronomistic meta-narrative and its social strategies can be traced in other problematic elements in Christian history. The social strategies of idol smashing, altar burning, the singling out and murdering of wicked or false priests and leaders have all played a part in most Christian reform movements throughout history. Some remnants of the Reformation in the Netherlands and in La Rochelle in France. The xenophobia and hatred of foreigners and their cultural and religious practices, and the narrative elements that see this as the purpose of the invasion and seizing of the land of Canaan from its inhabitants, function as key religious undergirdings of the 16th and 17th century doctrines of discovery and related colonial practices. In the Deuteronomistic ideology and meta-narrative, violence is a normative and necessary means by which religious, cultural, and moral purity and rectitude are enforced and imposed. Sorry, there's a slide of contemporary idol burning in the Philippines that was supposed to come up, but it didn't. So we can see how there's that whole social project at all these points of Reformation in our history, but particularly in the 16th and 17th century. These form the basis for a vast amount of communal violence. But because we may be critical of a constructed meta-narrative that imagines Israel as seizing the land of Canaan and destroying its inhabitants, we likely should remain cognizant of the fact that there is a long biblical critique of the Canaanite culture of city-states and their social and economic values. This violence is the downside of the Deuteronomistic ideology and its meta-narrative. I think it's important to recognize that it is also through the Deuteronomic movement that other elements of Northern Israelite tradition became embedded in the longer tradition, and ultimately as crucial elements in the entire canon. These include the holding together of justice and mercy as central to the being of God. Holding those together is another critical element in the problem Anselm and other theologians seek to work through in understanding the person and work of Christ. Monotheism itself is likely another element that after the Deuteronomists became a core of the tradition. Finally, the Deuteronomistic legal codes, whatever else they may recommend, hold at their center the poor, the widows, the orphans, the dispossessed, and the alien, as those for whom society must create justice, generosity, and equity if it seeks to be in right relationship with God and in its own social ordering. Both of today's texts raise profound and uneasy questions about violence as a choice of means in our biblical and faith tradition. But let's go back to Deborah, our first evidence of the radical tradition that both texts in their own way also represent. This committed and transformational woman is described in the text as making the choice to rise up or stand up. When the translators of the Septuagint, the Greek translators, rendered this song into Greek, they used the verb anhistemi, which can mean a wide range of things, such as to stand up, or to rouse to action, or to raise from the dead. In the Apostles' and Nicene Creeds, this is the verb used to describe the anticipated end of our community, the rising up of the flesh, or the rising up from the dead in order to know life. The Song of Deborah suggests that this is not a future event, but something that the committed faithful practice, like Deborah, on a day-to-day basis, in acts of resistance to oppression, acts of solidarity and community, and in acts celebrating those who make choices for justice, in the little ingenuities and subversions of the presuppositions of power, and in the ongoing critique of assumptions and hegemonies that undergird the structures of injustice. The resurrection of the body is thus not something invented by early Christians and done to us by God at the end of time, but something in which the community of faith has been actively participating since 1250 BCE. And as Deborah knew well, to stand up for and with the body is something to celebrate and honor, because in such acts of courage and moral choice are the seeds of hope and transformation already being glorified and revealed.